my pleasure to introduce Professor Simon Mohun. Simon is Emeritus Professor of Political Economy, not politics and not economics, but political economy, and that may emerge from what he says. University of London, Queen Mary College. Simon joined Queen Mary at the same time as I did, I think, in 1972, so we share a similar history, but he's been around a lot more than I have. And he's got a perspective on Marxism, which I find, well, he's taught me a lot of what I know about it. I'm a botanist by training, and one couldn't want for a better tutor. And Simon's also, I should say, a good friend of the Marx Memorial Library and Workers' School. So, Simon.
So the first thing is to say that, within a sort of Marxist framework, we're used to thinking of a slave mode of production, a feudal mode of production, a capitalist mode of production, whatever, history as a succession of different modes of production. And each mode of production is based on some sort of specific class relation. Slave owners and slaves, feudal landowners and people who just work on the land, or capital and labour. Now, we also know that class relations are essentially property relations, and that transitions from one mode of production to another are actually rather complex and typically take quite long periods of time. And the reason for that is that while you might have something like a revolution, such as, say, the English Revolution of the 1640s, it doesn't mean thereby that, if the revolution is successful, it doesn't mean that property relations are instantly transformed. It takes a long time. And it's a process of generally forcibly dispossession of existing property owners in one form or another. Now, what determines the transformation from one mode of production to another? Well, I'm not going to say very much about this at all, because the talk isn't really about this. But basically, the general idea, which is I've tried to summarize classic Marxism in a very, very small number of words. You get the development of the forces of production that creates an environment of some sort in which existing relations of production constrain the further development of the forces of production. And then what happens is, when those constraints get too big in some sense, a revolution occurs. And that revolution changes the content of the existing relations of production. So, and the general idea for capitalism is forces of production are increasingly socialized, but are increasingly constrained by privatized relations of production. So that's the general idea. And I don't want to talk very much more about that, except to say, if you ever read Claude Lévi-Strauss's autobiography, he was a French social anthropologist, he draws an analogy between psychoanalysis, Marxism, and geology, and has a few pages on how similar these sorts of subjects are as academic disciplines. The reason being, they're basically structured around different levels and the hierarchy of levels. So why is this relevant? Well, I have a friend who works at the University of Stanford, or used to work at the University of Stanford, and he was describing how he looks out of his office at this scrubland, semi-desert, beautiful, serene environment near Stanford in California. And it's all very placid and peaceful, and it looks beautiful. And what you're looking at is the San Andreas Fault directly. So what's happening underneath is plate tectonics are moving, and at some point, the constraints of the top level will give way, and there'll be a major earthquake. And that's the sort of idea that this is trying to capture. But I'm not going to talk any more about that, because that's not what this talk is about. This talk is much more about transformations within a mode of production. That is to say, if we just have a sort of parallel formulation, then we're saying, well, again, this development of the forces of production creates an environment in which the form of existing relations of production constrain their further development. And you can then have a transformation that initiates changes in that form, not in the content, but in the form. So, what are the sorts of transformations we're going to be looking at? Well, they're basically transformations in methods of appropriating and controlling surplus value, and with associated transformations in the realm of politics, forms of the state, and so on. Now, in fact, having said what these transformations are, I realise I'm not actually going to say any more about them, but we'll come back to that right at the end. There's a reason for that. If we say, oh, well, we're good Marxists here, what did Marx actually say about periodisation within capitalism? And of course, he doesn't talk about this explicitly very much, except in rather general and abstract terms. So he talks, for instance, of an early stage of capitalism. And what he means by that is that essentially the techniques of production are unchanged from the feudal era. So that all you've got is literally a transformation of the relations of production, but with the same production processes, the same techniques, and so on. And he calls this a formal subsumption of labour to capital. And he has various passages in Capital which describe aspects of this system. So he talks about simple and extended reproduction. He talks about the extension of the division of labour via cooperation. He talks about the acceleration of specialisation in manufacturing, meaning by manufacturing, production by hand, literally, okay? And then, and for Marx, in these circumstances, the production of absolute surplus value predominates, meaning by that, you get more surplus value from employing more people, and you get more surplus value from lengthening the time for which they work, okay? Straightforward. So that's Marx's sort of early stage of capitalism. And then he goes on to say, well, actually, this stage is a bit limited because what actually happens is that as the labour force expands, as more and more people are sort of drawn into capitalist production, especially women and children, and the working day is lengthened, that's actually destructive to the reproduction of labour power. That is, capitalism is literally a goose killing the, what do you say? Killing the golden egg? No, that's not right. Anyway, whatever. So what we get is state intervention in the middle of the 19th century around a whole series of factory acts with increasing limits on the length of the working day and the employment of women and children. So that's descriptively what happened, but why did it happen? It happened for two reasons. One was it had to happen because capitalism was destroying its own labour force. But secondly, it could happen because power-driven machinery was beginning to revolutionise production processes. And for Marx, this was basically about what he called the real subsumption of labour to capital. And it's basically to do with the introduction of capitalist-specific technology. The old techniques inherited from feudalism are superseded. There's genuine sort of technical progress, capitalist technical progress. So he calls this the real subsumption of labour to capital, and the production of relative surplus value predominates. Okay, now this is all abstract. It will get more empirical, I have to say, so bear with me. So in this early stage, where we've got absolute surplus value predominating, what's the form of control? It's sort of an unmediated direct control of production by owner-managers. And what's the main form of appropriation of surplus value? It's what Marx calls the profit of enterprise. But in this later stage, we have much more sophisticated controls. We've got direct or process control over the production line itself, and this becomes the function of a specialised managerial stratum who earn a wage. They're not owners at all, they're wage workers. We get the separation of ownership and control that facilitates that. We have accounting control, so you can think of somebody's got to make a choice of product, choice of technique, choice of input purchases and output sales, how to do it, what's the relation between plants and divisions, all issues surrounding vertical and horizontal integration. All of this requires growing white-collar employment. And then you've got financial control, essentially exercised through what Marx calls money, capital in exchange, but what he means is the growth of a credit system and a sort of integrated system of banks and stock exchanges and so on. That's all right. And in terms of appropriation, then interest revenues become much, much more important. So there's a chair here and there's a chair there. If you can squeeze in without somehow. Okay, so that's, if you like, that's all we can get from Marx. It's very abstract and it's very general. And it covers, 400-500 years of history in sort of 2 stages. So it's not really helpful, except, it does identify things that are important. Okay, well, that sort of process in the 20th century gets a bit, well, this is my prejudice now, gets a sort of a bit bastardized, really, where you get the development of a sequence, or an interpretation of capitalism that is a sequence from competitive capitalism through monopoly capitalism to state monopoly capitalism. Okay? And you don't see much of this anymore, but it was common in the 50s and 60s and maybe the first half of the 70s. Are we okay? You could maybe get somebody there, and there's a stool here. I just need one of them. Yeah. So the general idea is that the development of capitalism undermines its own further development. That is to say, competition generates monopoly. Lenin emphasized this in his work Periodism, which wasn't a theoretical work. It was intended to be a popular work. So there's no theory about how and why capitalism develops from a competitive stage to a monopoly stage, but Lenin asserts it. And the general idea is that you've got an economy based on big business, which is to say monopoly or oligopoly positions in most industries and markets. So industries are dominated by a few large firms, and sometimes even just 1 or 2 large firms. And that in turn develops into something called state monopoly capitalism, hence STAMOCAP for short, which is the next stage. And one of the problems is whether it's supposed to be a final stage. And the general idea is basically the state intervenes in the economy. Why does it intervene in the economy? Basically to protect large businesses from competition by smaller firms. So that you get a close partnership between big business and government to provide a framework within which big corporations can operate most effectively. And then this was fairly political because the idea was, how could you oppose this? Well, you would have a labour movement allied with progressive middle classes and small business against the state and big business. And of course, the leadership of this alliance was to be the Communist Party. So that's a rather crude waltz through state monopoly capitalism. And we can say some things about this. It was obviously an attempt to theorize the post-World War II expansion of the state, of state activity in an economy. And, well, I've said it was left a bit high and dry as the structural characteristics of the post-1945 economy began to change. But in particular, there's no analysis of economics in it, because if the state and big business can work together to counteract the effects of competition, where exactly does that leave the Marxist analysis of capitalism, which is, in which competition is completely fundamental? There's also no analysis of the class basis of the state. It's just a sort of monolithic structure of domination. There's no analysis of ideology. Why does neoliberal ideology, for instance, emphasize and celebrate reductions in state intervention? And there's no analysis of politics. So what's the class difference then between a socialist state and a bourgeois state? One of the difficulties is it's very easy to put the USSR into this framework. It's just an extreme form, and that raises a whole lot of other questions. So we can leave this one behind. So we've got then two general ideas. There's Marx's idea, which goes from absolute surplus value predominating to relative surplus value predominating, and that's very abstract. And we've got this competitive capitalism, monopoly capitalism, state monopoly capitalism, and that seems to me to be very much tied to the golden age Fordist era of the world economy, and it's also teleological, meaning by that it's very much a sequence and it's not at all clear what happens after state monopoly capitalism. Well, it is. I mean, it's socialism, but there's a bit of a... It's not an obvious arrow. So that's one approach, or one set of approaches to periodization. Another approach looks at Marx's circuit of capital. So this is the circuit of capital, and basically, so it goes M to C, M to C, C through the production process to C prime to M prime, and reinvestment. So this is just really a slightly expanded description of Marx's circuit of capital. Why is this used? Well, some people have thought, well, maybe we can think that capitals are geographically based and geographically competing. And so as they're expanding across national boundaries, does the circuit of capital provide a sort of basis for periodization? How am I doing for time, Rich? Okay. So these, how might we look at this? Well, this is, the graph goes from, you can't quite see it actually, it goes, this is 1882, so that's the year before Marx died. It's a completely arbitrary starting point. And this is 2017. Okay, so it's fairly up-to-date graph, and it's, what the graph shows you is exports and imports added up together as a percentage of GDP. So it's a measure of the economy's openness. Okay? And you can see that within this framework, that the era, this is the era before the First World War. So there's sort of fluctuations between 50 and 60%. This is 1913, that peak there. There's then the First World War and a very, very violent fluctuation, 1919 to 1920, which is one of the most violent fluctuations in the British economy as Britain's staple industries collapsed. But then we've got the 20s and then the collapse through the 1930s, and then this point is what, about 1942 or 1943. Obviously in the Second World War you wouldn't expect international trade to be increasing. It was mostly being sunk by U-boats. So we can see then that it's generally a downward trend. There's then a post-war rapid recovery, which then sort of flags a bit. And here, this is the sort of the 50s and 60s. It's pretty flat, running about 40% of GDP. And then it starts to increase again. So this is the 1970s. And then it falls back to, this is about 1990, and then it rises again back to about 60%. So is this the internationalization of commodity capital? Does it provide us with anything very clear? Well, no, not really. I mean, it sort of falls and then it rises, and that's really all one can say. So that's the internationalization of commodity capital. And commodity capital is basically this bit here. This bit here, purchases of inputs from overseas and sale of outputs to overseas. Okay, that's what one's looking at as a percentage of the whole of output. But of course, more than just goods and services are internationally traded. You've got financial capital, that's the M to C stage of the circuit. And what we would like to look at then is international capital flows. Meaning by that, money hoards, portfolio investment, profit and interest remittances, things like that. And then also the internationalization of productive capital, the C to P to C prime stage, which is the development of multinational corporations, companies siting their production activities geographically across a wide area. It's very difficult to find any simple evidence that clearly distinguishes between these two. So what I've done is actually combined them, and I've just looked at, well, this graph covers the same period, and this is investment income, both flowing into the UK and flowing out of the UK, added up as a percentage of GDP. And it's interesting for two reasons. One is there's a peak just before the First World War, but it's only about 10%. Thereafter, once the wartime years, is a small recovery in the 20s, but then it's pretty much completely flat at 5% of GDP. Obviously, remember, the reason for looking at these things as percentages of GDP is that it normalizes them. Obviously, these things are increasing all the time, but so's GDP. Okay? So the ratio between the two is flat up until this point there. And that is really quite interesting because that's 1972. So it predates Thatcher. It predates the emergence of China onto the world stage. It predates most analyses of globalization. It's really very striking that it's the 1970s that see this huge increase. Thereafter, this spike is the financial crisis, the run-up to the financial crisis and the collapse thereafter. But you can see there's sort of basically a step change from a fluctuation between 5 and 10% to a fluctuation between, 20 and 25%. But just one change. So again, does this provide us with a basis for periodization? Well, not really. Let's go back to thinking about the forces of production. Now, what do we mean by the forces of production? We just mean the state of technical knowledge and how it's applied to production processes. It's dynamic. Forces of production are dynamic because capitalism is based on competition. And what we mean by competition is basically the idea that capitalists invest in order to steal a march on their rivals. Okay? So Sainsbury's invests because it wants to take market share from Waitrose or Tesco or whatever. It's that basic idea. So capitalists invest typically in non-labour means of production, so everything except labour, and they do that in order to increase labour productivity. So if you think about it very crudely, you're thinking about mechanisation in some way. If they're successful in increasing labour productivity, they'll be able to undercut their competitors through price reductions. They'll gain market share. But after a bit, the innovation will become generalised through the industry until there's another innovation, and so it goes on and on and on. Now, what's important about this is that a capitalist, therefore, has to consider the cost of the investment and the benefits of the investment, the innovating capitalist. What's the cost? Well, the cost is that investment typically increases capital intensity. That is to say, real fixed capital per hour of labour employed. Okay? Now, it's important you hang on to this. I'll keep repeating it. Capital intensity is real fixed capital per hour of labour employed. So, loosely, and it is loose, it's machines per worker. Okay? That's the general idea. But why do they do this? They do this in order to generate greater labour productivity. Labour productivity is real output per hour of labour employed. So the question then for a capitalist is, which increases faster, capital intensity or labour productivity? Okay, capital intensity or labour productivity. So labour productivity, output per labour hour, capital intensity, the means of production per labour hour required to produce that output. That ratio has a name that you've probably not come across unless you're an economist. It's called capital productivity. That doesn't mean that capital is productive, that's just a name, that's just what it's come to be called. Okay? It's the ratio of output per hour to the means of production per hour required to produce that output per hour. Now, historically, the predominant pattern of technical change has been labour saving and capital using. Okay? That's the predominant form of technical change. So capital intensity is increasing. But what happens to the ratio between the two depends on what happens to labour productivity. So you can see that since capital productivity is a ratio of this to this, if the top rises faster than the bottom, then capital productivity is rising. But if the top rises less fast than the bottom, capital productivity is falling. Okay? Now, this will turn out to be a bit important. Okay, relations of production. Well, this is easy enough. We know relations of production, power relations, class relations. And if we want to sort of concretize it, we can just think of profits as a share of output. Why does that concretize it? Because the profit share and the wage share add up to 1. If a third of your output goes to profits, 2/3 goes to wages. Okay, the profit share and the wage share add up to 1, and one of them can only increase at the expense of the other. If the profit share rises, the wage share falls. So it's a sort of rough, crude measure of class struggle. It is crude because some profits you would think are really labour income. For instance, pension payments to the working class are sourced from profits on investment. So they'll appear in profits, but they go to the working class. Some labour incomes are better seen as profits. So for instance, the salaries earned by the top 1%. Okay? They appear in the labour income statistics, but you would think that they're really a disguised form of profits. Okay? So you can think of, there's lots of qualifications then like this, but basically the profit share is a crude approximation of the state of class struggle. So, understood in this way, can we use the forces and relations of production to periodize changes within capitalism? Okay, so let me just remind you, forces of production, investment typically increases capital intensity. That enables greater labour productivity, but which increases faster? And that determines the movement in the ratio between the two, which is called capital productivity. So that's the forces of production. And the relations of production are just simply how much of the product goes to capital. And that's measured by the profit share. So we've two things to look at, capital productivity and the profit share. But before we do that, you might say, well, hang on a minute, I thought capitalism was about profits, and you haven't mentioned profits yet. So let's just talk very quickly about the rate of profit. Capitalism is about money making. If you had to give a one-word definition of what is capitalism, it's about making money. Okay? So movements in the average rate of profit are clearly going to tell you something about how good is this capitalist economy for capitalists. Okay? If the rate of profit is rising, you'd say, nice one. If it's falling, you'd say there are problems here. Okay? So the rate of profit is just a summary statistic of how successful capitalists are at making money. So can we use movements in the rate of profit to periodize capitalism? So we've got three variables: the rate of profit, the profit share, and capital productivity. Okay? They're not independent of each other. If you think, for instance, of class struggle and capital productivity, capitalists invest, they mechanize. How are the workers going to use this equipment? Maybe they're going to resist, right? Maybe there's going to be struggles at the point of production. Maybe innovation isn't so simple. Maybe there'll be slowdowns, works to rule, whatever. Okay? It's not automatic, the process whereby within this capital productivity term, it's not automatic that investment translates into labour productivity. In some sense, it's got to be forced and controlled. So class struggle and capital productivity are clearly related. But the other thing to say, and this will be obvious to an economist, but might not be otherwise, the rate of profit is actually the product of profit share and capital productivity. That is, the rate of profit is not independent of these two, it's actually the product of them. Here's the profit share. Oh no, you can see this if you want, but it's true, they're the product of one another. Now, there's huge debates about the rate of profit in the literature. You've probably come across some of them. And these, you can think of these debates as, well, movements in the rate of profit, do they cause what happens? Or are they consequences of what happens? So a sort of a fundamentalist dogmatic Marxist will go, rate of profit, oh, I know about that, falling rate of profit, crisis, boom, boom. So that's the rate of profit causing something. Whereas a Keynesian would say, failures of aggregate demand, crisis, profits collapse. That's the rate of profit as a consequence of developments in the economy. Now, I'm not going to pursue this at all here, just to say I'm using the rate of profit purely descriptively. Okay. Oops, done that again. Right, so measurement details. This is a wonkish slide. Let's skip that. Okay, so here's the rate of profit for the British economy from 1882 to 2017. And this shows some points of interest. The black line are the actual data. The red line is, can you see it as red? Just about. The red line is a trend line drawn through it, just to sort of get rid of some of the peaks and troughs. So what does this say? Well, clearly there are long run cycles. They seem to last 40 to 50 years. Now, many people in the past have talked about this as sort of long waves. Schumpeter was a well-known economist who thought about this. Kondratiev was the first person to think about these long waves. And if you like this idea, then you have to explain, well, what are the turning points? What determines these long waves? If you've ever read any literature by Ernest Mandel, the Belgian Trotskyist, I'm actually showing my age here, he's long dead now, but he was writing in the 1970s, and he got seduced by long wave theory towards the end of his life and devoted a huge amount of writing to it. Anyway, so there are clearly cycles. There's a peak around 1900 or so. Again, this sort of just before the First World War. Then there's the slump as the British economy collapses through the First World War and afterwards. This is the 20s, where you've got very low rates of profit, a period, most violent period of class struggle in the 20th century in the British economy. But the rate of profit is gradually and then steeply increasing as we go through the 30s and into the Second World War. And it actually peaks in 1942, right up here. Then there's the sort of normal post-war collapse because economies are dislocated and require quite a lot of adjustment to start employing demobilized workers from the armed forces, investment for bomb factories, and so on and so on. But then what you've got is a long collapse from about 1960 through to 1973. A long collapse in the rate of profit, and then a pretty extraordinary rise from the 70s through the 70s. This is the years of the social contract in the Labour governments of the 1970s. This is North Sea oil coming on stream and the collapse in the exchange rate, 1980-81, and the collapse of British manufacturing. And this is Thatcherism. Whoa, pretty good. Up to the middle of the 1990s. Then there's a sort of sharp fluctuation, collapsing to 2000, and that's probably something to do with the bursting of the dot-com bubble. And then you've got the rise to 2008, and then a collapse again. So does this help us? Well, not really, because...
How is this measured, the rate of profit? Is that across all sectors? Or?
Okay, well, I sort of sloughed over that, didn't I? Wonkish. Okay, the numerator, profits, is basically GDP at factor cost, less imputed rent. Do you know about imputed rent? All householders, right, people pay rent on where they live, but lots of people don't because they own their houses, okay? If a renter buys the house that they rent, GDP will go down because there's no rental payment anymore, so a component of GDP disappears. Statisticians don't like that because they think that's a silly consequence of accounting rules. So they say each homeowner, each owner-occupier pays a rent to themselves, okay, as imputed rent. And that means that if a renter buys a house, GDP doesn't fall because the renter still pays rent as their owner-occupier, but just to themselves. And of course, they don't pay rent at all, so I've subtracted it. Less total wages, and then less an estimated wage component of what's mixed income, basically income from partnerships, income of the self-employed, and so on. And the denominator, the fixed capital stock, is UK total non-financial assets, less dwellings, less the implied value of land under dwellings, less other machinery, equipment and weapons systems for central government, because I think that item is mostly weapons. And if you like, this is a macroeconomic rate of profit. It's sort of covering the whole economy. It's not a rate of profit for financial and commercial companies. So that's the rate of profit. Does that help us? No, it doesn't. What about the profit share? Okay, remember I said there were three things: rate of profit, profit share, and capital productivity. So here's the profit share. As again, it's quite interesting. It rises again up until just before the First World War. Then there's a complete collapse in the First World War, stagnation in the 1920s, I mean fluctuating stagnation, but at a much lower level. And then after the trough of the Great Depression, you start a long run rise in the profit share right up to 1960. You've then got, in trend terms, a gradual fall, but not by very much, to 1973. You can see the actual movements are more violent. The red line is sort of averaging them out. And then you've got this recovery from the 1973 recession and Thatcherism up to 1990. And then this is actually rather curious. Remember, it's the profit share. This is the Lawson boom at the end of the 1980s in house prices, engendered by house prices. And this doesn't correspond to any significant event at all that I can find. This is the dot-com bust, and then this is the time since up to the financial crisis and beyond. And you can see in terms of the profit share, the financial crisis doesn't really have a huge effect compared with some of the other fluctuations. So, does the profit share help us? Well, not in and of itself. What about capital productivity? So I'm nearly at the end now. And this is much more interesting. First of all, it's much less fluctuating. And secondly, it's much clearer what the cycles are. So in particular, from, let's ignore the 19th century, basically from around the First World War, this is the very sharp fluctuation for the British economy, 1918, 1919, 1920, 1921, which was when Britain's industries collapsed. But basically, capital productivity is rising right through to World War II. Capital productivity rising, what does that mean? It means as capital intensity increases, labour productivity increases faster. Why might that happen? Well, because defeats in the 1920s, perhaps, for the working class, after all, the general strike fiasco, and so on. Maybe it's something to do with that, but we'll come back to that later. Once we get to the Second World War peak, There's then a long collapse going right through to 1980. What does this downward stretch mean? It means that to get a unit of labour productivity, you have to invest more and more and more. Capital intensity has to rise faster and faster for a given rise in labour productivity. And that goes right through to Mrs. Thatcher being elected, or Ronald Reagan being elected, and it turns round and it rises. So right through to the financial crisis. And then, so this is saying this rising bit, remember what that's saying, it's saying labour productivity is relatively easy to get. You have increases in capital intensity and they generate bigger increases in labour productivity. Why might that be? Well, it could be long-run defeat of the working class, smashing of trade unions, and it also might be the internet age. That is actually what you're seeing is a generic technology that makes labour productivity much easier to get. And then the last interesting thing is that since 2009, capital productivity has been falling. Okay, let's just get to the, I seem to have lost my thing here. Okay, so this is the last slide. So what I'm suggesting here is that trends in capital productivity what do? They reflect development of the productive forces. They provide some theoretical basis for periodising the UK economy. And empirical evidence provides some support. So what are the stages? Well, from the early 1900s to the early 1940s, we have rising capital productivity. This is the era of the free market economy and protectionism, 20s and the 30s. From the early 40s through to 1980, we've got falling capital productivity. And that era is precisely what one means by the so-called golden age. In French, the 30 glorious years, often called the golden age, which comes to an end with the first OPEC price rise in 1973, but then staggers along until 1979, 1980. Then we've got from 1980 to the financial crisis, rising capital productivity, but we know what this period's called. It's the neoliberal period. It's neoliberalism. And what's interesting now is we've got a fourth stage, because from the financial crisis to the present, we've got falling capital productivity. And we can call this the age of austerity, if you like. So what seems critical is the relationship between changes in capital intensity and changes in labour productivity. So I said that this is the one feature that I discovered, this capital productivity graph, which seemed very neat to me. But the next steps are obviously, which I'm not going to do here, is to explain the relative movements and to relate these to changing forms of surplus extraction. But there are some things one might want to point to. So two final points, which I haven't put on the slides. One is, if you're thinking of technical progress, you can think of really two different types. One is, a firm has some production process, and then a manager has a good idea and says, why don't we do this instead, this innovation, we can do that, and something like that. Something that's very industry specific. If it's industry specific, then it will affect all the firms in that industry, but it's not going to affect other industries. On the other hand, there are other types of technical innovation which affect all industries. So for instance, what about in the 1920s and the 30s, connecting all factories to the national grid? Okay, that's clearly something, it's a big innovation, it's highly capital intensive, and it affects all firms. Okay? Or the development of microprocessors. That affects all firms. Or the revolution which sees metals replaced by plastics. That's going to affect all firms. So some types of technical change affect all firms in the economy. Other types of technical change affect only individual firms and individual industries. So clearly one needs quite an interesting and detailed empirical analysis. What era are we in? So for instance, one might say the age of austerity. Is it a new era? Why isn't it just the neoliberal era continued? So you could say, well, maybe the microprocessor revolution from the 1980s through the 1990s, maybe its effects have largely worked themselves out. And what we're waiting for is the next new big one, which everybody says at the moment is going to be robotics. Or maybe not, right? I mean, these are interesting questions. I don't have an answer.